Okay, so yesterday in the keynote, David DeWalt raised pretty well the rapid change in technology that we're seeing and how that change in technology is having a huge impact and creating an evolution in IT delivery models. This is not news to this group. You live with this every day, you know this. And you're also hearing, and have been hearing for quite some time, about the advanced persistent threats. Most important in this is not the advanced part, because not really that advanced. It's the persistent and the targeted aspects of them. But what's important about this is that this has, as David mentioned yesterday, made preventative controls, the traditional preventative controls, it's evolved them to the point that they are necessary but not sufficient. So to move forward, we must recognize that the external attacks we're faced with, that sooner or later somebody's going to get in. So we need to move from focusing on just the preventative controls to augmenting them and being sure we understand what we're going to do when somebody gets in and be able to detect and disrupt those attacks quickly. Critical to this is looking, interestingly enough, at the insider threat. Looking at what your own insiders are doing for their regular everyday job, whether it's a mistake or a malicious activity, so that we understand what is normal for that type of behavior, so that we recognize the abnormal activity and the risks. And I mention this because an external attacker, once they've gotten in, looks just like someone who's inside your organization. And the key piece of context that's important is not only the history of the activity, but understanding what's normal for your organization. And the most important piece of context for that is who that user is, who the service might be, and what their peers are doing. So evaluating the activity in context with identity and the role. Now, in this context, in this world, when would you allow an external identity into your environment? This is what I'll be talking about for the next little bit. So I have a number of slides. I have a case study near the end. And if there's a compelling question, please feel free to go ahead and interrupt me. We can make this a bit more interactive. We have a small enough group here. I'm going to start by just answering what BYOI is, for those who aren't as familiar with it. I'll get into why do we care, when we should allow it, and what others are doing. Again, I have a case study involved. Now, before I go on beyond this, show of hands. Is anybody evaluating the use of external identity in your environment today, or have an active project? Okay, that's great. Okay, that's actually more than I normally see when I ask that question, because this is still very, very much an emerging topic. And you'll see why as I move on. So, as I move on, the first thing is if you search BYOI, you get some interesting results. Most of these make sense, but I'm not sure what bring your own improv would be. I don't really have a good mental picture for that, but interesting enough. So bring your own identity is what we're talking about. So literally, we're talking about leveraging an external identity provider and then allowing that to be something we trust as it comes into our organization. They handle the authentication, we handle the authorization, and we move on beyond that. So this is not a new concept within single sign-on, and for a number of cases, what's really new is that this is somebody completely outside of your organization and your environment that you're trusting to do the work associated with managing that identity. And this is chiefly coming out of the social world. Show of hands, how many people in this room are awful tired of having to add a whole new profile every time you want to download a white paper? Okay? How many people have researched something you wanted to buy online and then chose to go to Amazon because you already had your credit card there and didn't have to create a new account? Okay? This is what's driving it in the social world. It's just awful convenient. And this is not lost on the identity providers, some of the social organizations out there. They know that if you choose them as their primary identity, they get a lot of strength out of that, and they get to market that capability. So this is what's driving it in the social world. BYOD, ironically or coincidentally, is helping to drive it a little more into the corporate, the government, and other worlds. Because with BYOD, you're already overwhelmed with identities. We all start to think of our mobile devices as an extension of ourselves and part of our own identity. And as we're starting to take our personal equipment and blending our social and personal lives in with the work, this is bringing up the topic of BYOI more and more within enterprises, governments, all types of organizations. So this is what we're talking about, is how it's being driven in, and then what are we going to do about it. Brought this Gartner slide with me just to show how it's growing. I saw the show of hands, so less than 5%, and this is just dealing with retail, not overall enterprise. So I wasn't surprised it was a small show of hands, but it's expected to go rapidly, and based on what I've seen, it's already begun. So why do we care? The first part is that there is very real value here. So already we illustrated to us there's value of not having to add a new profile every time I interact. But there's extreme value when I'm having to, when I get to reduce the amount of effort required to mint, manage, and administer identities. And I'll illustrate that with part of the use case in a minute. It also provides value in other ways. So if I am an organization doing marketing, or I'm an organization providing a service, I have the ability to leverage not only a profile, a user coming in, adding a user profile, adding a bunch of false information about themselves that I can't use for anything, but because they're using a social identity they use externally, the chances that they're going to provide rich information that may not be sensitive information that I have to protect at all because it's hosted externally, but that I can access, I have the ability to tailor my services and tailor my views to that individual user. And I have the ability to have them not abandon the site or add Mickey Mouse as the username. So very strong value there. But it changes the risk dynamic quite a bit, and I'll touch on this quite a few times during these slides. So what does it mean when I'm no longer minting the identity? I'm no longer controlling how it gets reset, controlling how it's being adjusted, and what people have to do to get in and alter the configuration information associated with it, but I'm trusting to do that with somebody outside. I have the advantage, I don't necessarily have to keep any of this privacy information, this private, personally identifiable information local. I can simply access it when I need it and get rid of it. So I don't have to host it at all. And, but anything I do keep, I have to maintain the full responsibility like any other privacy information I have. So the dynamic changes. The discussion hasn't, but who's responsible for what does, and the user now plays a role in this. So should I allow BYOI? And the answer that you're going to see from me is that it depends, and I know you're all surprised by that answer. It's a balancing act. So to begin with, let's look at some of the things you'd evaluate. When you're looking at allowing an external identity in, one of the things you have to determine is which ones you will let in. Which ones are appropriate? Is it a Facebook? Is it a LinkedIn? Is it something new that you've never seen before? Well, you have to evaluate what due diligence and what controls they have in place to control the validity of that identity. How are they protecting the end user? How are they protecting themselves? And if you're using that identity, how much control, how much confidence are you going to have that it truly is that individual? And if one day an identity is compromised, how will you know about it and what will you do? So these are some of the primary concerns. Selecting who you will use and making sure you've done a thorough review of that, but also ensuring that you understand what you'll do and that you understand what the risk will be if that identity is hacked. So taking this, everything that I've used as an example so far has really been focused on external identities for very low risk uses. So I'm talking about coming in and accessing a white paper. Well, I only need general information to do that. I want to know generally how to reach them. I don't need any personally identifiable information. Maybe I want to know what the career is, what geographic location, some of this information. I'm not exposing a lot. I'm not accessing a lot. So the risk of a breach of that identity is very low. So that's a nice, safe use. When I set up to privilege users, which is one of the discussions around BYOI today, it raises another question. And I'll use an example again back to social. So if you are interacting with Apple, you can do quite a few things with the Apple device, with the Apple site, before you actually have any type of additional authentication. But the minute you want to use some more advanced capabilities, you'll get a prompt for an additional login. They'll ask you additional security questions. They'll revalidate who you are. So they've got that small portion of step-up authentication. If you deal with Google and you access their site or their services from a machine that hasn't been the machine you've accessed in the past or accessed it from in the past, you will again have a case where they'll challenge you and ask you additional security questions to help validate that this is really you again. These are strong measures, and this is just a sliver of what's possible for step-up authentication. The challenge is, if you're going to allow an external identity to be the one your employee comes in with, and then you're going to allow that to be the identity that you map to authorize them to access resources in the organization, you're going to have to do some of this, clearly. The cost that you're going to have to undergo to make that happen is really what you're going to have to weigh against the risk, or in this case, the savings from avoiding having to mint or manage the identity in the first place. So in some cases, for some of the most secure environments, I can't even see it working, because the amount of effort you're going to have to do the step-up authentication and administration is going to outweigh the original savings. You're going to have to do all the work anyway. So if in that case, if you're doing it, it's going to be because of convenience to contractors and others, not really on the cost savings. So again, it comes back to balance. I'll go ahead and I have this case study, which I'll walk through briefly. And then following this, I have an example of someone's social identity, their digital identity that has been hacked, give you an idea of what was involved. It includes many of the identity vendors I just mentioned, and I'll walk through it just to give you an idea of what that risk is again. I also, at the end of this presentation, have my email address. If any of you are thinking about doing something like what I'm going to describe for New York, let me know, and I can connect you with New York, and you can ask them the questions directly. But what we're discussing here is that New York City, like many organizations like this, is looking to provide better service to their constituents. They want to provide better transparency, and they want to provide a website that offers many of the services they would normally have in offices or is convoluted through different websites in a way to where the user experience is strong, so they can tailor it to the user coming to the environment. So what they did was they started looking through their options. And the challenge is, this is over 8 million identities. So they already have enough problems managing their internal contractors and staff. Sitting down and minting and administering another 8+ million identities would be a substantial cost. But again, they're weighing it. They're not looking for the privileged user use case. They're looking for the lightly secured one. And what they're doing is you have to take into account each of the constituencies. So the individuals, to get people actively using the websites, you're going to have to ensure that they're willing to register. So many of them already have social identities. If you can take the registration abandonment problem away, if you can get them to use a profile they've already created, then you can get them in. You can get them participating. The officials want to deliver a better service. They want to deliver greater transparency. They've got to do it within their budgets, and they want to be able to see them doing it within their budgets and see them delivering greater service for the same or less money. So they have some very keen reasons to do this and some serious constraints. The site administrators, their staffs aren't going to grow to do this. So how are they going to manage an additional 8 million plus identities without having a substantial increase in staff and horsepower and computing? So that's the challenge. So what New York is in the process of doing is, again, moving on their Always Open campaign. And what they're doing is they're updating their access controls. They're evaluating where public resources should be used like this, and I'll give a quick example of that in just a minute. But they're allowing the social identities to make this something they can actually achieve. And they're using social identities for 2 reasons. 1, the cost of managing 8 million identities. 2, they're able to leverage key aspects of the information that's in these profiles to tailor the service. If you live in a certain area of New York, you're going to see the things and the articles and the papers and the forms that are relevant to that portion. If you're in a certain age group, you're going to see the policies and benefits for that age group. And they have the ability to keep a lot of the information outside their own databases and to limit the amount of private information that's available to them. It's only doing this in the broadest sense to tailor the customer experience and allow them to navigate this labyrinthine set of policies, procedures, and what is normally a convoluted website with something that's coming along really well. So this is what they're doing. For the public resource use case, They had, I asked for one very simple example that they were considering. And it is a simple example, but I think it's illustrative. They're tennis courts. They have 60,000 people registered with permits, paid permits, to use the tennis courts. They have 500 tennis courts. The process for years has required going to somebody, and it's a paper, manual, horrendous process. So the obvious is, let's put it on the web. Well, if I put it on the web, then add it to everything else I'm doing, then I've got the identity problem and everything else. Since this is just one of many of the resource initiatives they could have as part of the overall transparency and providing a better service, this fits in nicely. They get to automate the process. They get to have it to where people can update their reservations at any time. They don't have to have staff on hand all the time, 24 hours a day to do this. They get to make that available under the always open mandate without any additional cost. They don't have to have sensitive information. This is a low-risk item. And they're even evaluating taking the financial transaction portion of it and pushing that to something like PayPal. They haven't decided yet, but in that case, they get to remove all of those challenges and just deliver this service. So this is what New York is doing. If the identity was breached for New York, they're not in trouble. Very little would happen here. The risk in this case is that somebody's tennis court reservation is missed. If somebody breaches an identity that comes in, they'll be able to see some forms that really belong to somebody else but not filled out. So low risk, low risk of privacy, low risk of having any administration or even altering the site. So this is an ideal case for BYOI and one that New York is proceeding on and addressing currently. Now, I have another section of the presentation, but I've spoken much faster than I normally would have, so I've gotten ahead. So I have lots of time for questions, or I'll let you out and have a break earlier. But has anybody heard of the Matt Honan breach or know who Matt Honan is? Hands. Okay, Matt Honan is Wired Magazine, and you can find information on this all over the web if you search. He wrote about it himself. But this is a great illustration. Hackers went out and they wanted access to his Twitter handle. They wanted to have fun with the Twitter handle. So this wasn't a financially motivated attack. This was something that we wanted to access the Twitter handle. They wanted to cause some trouble, and they wanted to see what they could do. And they caused him some significant pain. And a key part of it is that many of his social identities were all linked. Yes?
Isn't this the guy that wrote about his experience about trying to reclaim his identity?
Yes.
The guy, right?
Yeah. Okay. So there's many articles about this. I highly recommend reading them. And I'm using it because it's very illustrative of what's involved here. So if you're going to use BYOI for anything other than a low-risk case like New York, you need to consider what step-up authentication you're going to need to put in place. So in this case, he both recognized many flaws that these identity providers, external social identity providers, have in their systems, and I'm going to highlight some of those, but also his own part in this. So as a result of the breach, his entire identity was destroyed on the web. He had inappropriate comments delivered as him over the web through his Twitter handle. And while sitting and working with family members, his MacBook and his iPhone shut off and were wiped, losing all of the materials he had been working on. So it was very profound for him. His entire digital life was destroyed quickly. And he recognized his responsibility in this as well. He was the one that linked all of his accounts. He was the one that did not require some of the additional authentication and additional two-factor authentication in Gmail. So he took his own responsibility here. He recognized his own responsibility. But here's how it happened. They wanted access to his Twitter account. His Twitter account was linked to his Gmail account. So they went to the Gmail account and looked to see how they could reset the password. They noticed, though masked, that his email account was a me.com, which informed them that it was an Apple ID. So they then jumped to Apple, and they recognized that you need an address and the last 4 digits of a credit card number to get into that. So from there, they jumped to Amazon and realized that if they called in, if they could charm the support people with a name and with the name and the email address, they'll be able to come in and add a new credit card. And that's what they did. They got past and somehow worked around the security questions and added a bogus credit card number. They then hung up. So they didn't do that online. They called into the support. They then hung up, called back, got a different person, and because they knew the credit card number, were able to get the email address reset, or get the email account, sender password reset by email. When they did that, they were now in. They accessed his other credit card information, used the last 4 digits, and used that to go back and reset and work their way all the way back, and now owned him. His entire social identity and network identity was now owned by these hackers. They were interesting hackers because they then started chatting and emailing him through other accounts, just talking and taunting him. But this is what happened. So if you've done this like the city of New York and someone hacks this identity, there's very little risk. If you use it for other purposes, this is a big problem. How would you even know it was hacked? And if it was hacked, how would you know how to turn it off? How to remove that access? Again, step-up authentication is very important. Any questions about this?
So realistically, in the digital world, he's dead.
I'm sorry?
In the digital world, he's dead.
In the digital world, he is dead. He actually has an advantage, if you think about it, over any of us. While the risk of his Twitter statements being taken out of context, he's a technical news writer. So he had the ability to reach out and make a lot of noise that he had been breached and quickly debunk that this was actually him. So he avoided the social damage from that. He was also able to harass, politely, these identity providers, get them to help it clean it up. And if you look at the articles, he's extraordinarily courteous and respectful of them. So he's not calling out blame, and he's sharing his own blame as he writes about this. But he was dead, and he had lost the work he had been actively writing. He lost his access. It says when this originally occurred, he was actually working, I think it was his daughter or his niece, on his iPhone playing the games, and his phone shut off. So for whatever period, he was completely dead. But because he's in the public eye, because of the access he had, it was easier for him to clean this up than it would have been us. Yes?
What if his alternate email address was to the same provider? In other words, what if they had tried to hack into a Yahoo address and got into the Yahoo account from the first address, and it was simply looped back to another Yahoo email?
I have to think about that. As long as they could redirect or change that account, they'd be fine. If they can loop back only like that, then they would have been fine. He actually pointed out that if he had used two-factor authentication on Gmail, they would have been blocked and couldn't get past this. The real issue is that I see 2 core issues in this. Number one, Apple was using the last 4 digits of the credit card. As you know from working with Amazon, Amazon shows you that. So one of the challenges is that the different identity providers with linked accounts don't actually treat the same information the same way. So one considers sensitive, the other doesn't. That's a key problem. The core part, taking Matt out of the responsibility at all, is they were able to call in to the support desk, not answer security questions, and get them to reset the password. A lot of it came down to that.
I think I addressed this. I know Apple made a change supposedly about the last policy on using the last 4 because directly because it's
Yes.
I don't remember if Amazon had changed anything to it. I think they made some changes. Yeah, they did as well.
Yeah, they've had subsequent articles, but absolutely. But the question is, these guys are the best at it.
Yeah.
I'm expecting more and more identity providers to be there, and then I'm expecting to see some vendors become specialized non-social identity providers that may be for contractors and for others, and we'll have to see how that comes. I know people that are discussing it. I even know of organizations that provide central clearinghouses for healthcare, where you have sharing in a private cloud that's shared amongst multiple partnering organizations, and how you handle the identities, and the identities are all within that group. So there's a number of different variations in this, but this is what's involved. So it all comes to balance and making sure that you weigh the cost savings against the risk. City of New York, 8 million identities, this is a no-brainer. For something beyond that, and you start dealing with step-up authentication, depending on the level of access you're giving, you'll start moving in the direction to where this might make a little less sense as you move forward. So any other questions on this? Yes?
Just a comment too, with the state like New York or even state California, the language issue too is probably another factor.
Absolutely.
How many different languages and how many dialects you've got going on.
Imagine they log in, you see the identity, somewhere in their profile it has their language, and you show that to them. Or the first time they do it, you give them that option, and from then on you're able to do it. And you didn't have to mint the identity, you didn't have to do the routine administration of it, you have none of that headache.
Well,
absolutely.
Digital natives being more prominent now too in this kind of situation, we're probably seeing more of a need or more of a want of the BYOI coming into the workforce and all the situation that happens with that.
Absolutely. I saw, yes?
I had actually just a question. You mentioned the importance of step-up authentication in regards to this. If there is something more sensitive, and you don't necessarily want to, you want partially the convenience of the identity, of their own identity, but you need to have something more, you know. How do you determine what's appropriate to use for step-up authentication? Because you don't know what's being used to be the original authentication, so you don't know what might be redundant to something that's already compromised.
I was about to answer your question, then you finished, and I had to augment my answer. I was first going to say it doesn't matter, that you need to evaluate that all on your own and determine what's best. If you're looking at what's out in social, I think this is something you can figure out pretty well, because you're not going to use somebody's credit card information because you don't want to deal with that privacy information, especially if it's a contractor or employee. There's no need for you to have that. I wouldn't trust email addresses. I wouldn't trust a lot of these things. So I would likely use some additional security questions that are unique to you, or use other things like physically having the device in hand. Okay, so sending a specific text message to it, or using the idea, not routing it through email, using things like this, or using things specific to your company that are the step-up information for your company and not associated with social. So I would separate them, but I think the nature of the things you would ask will be different anyway. Does that help at all? Yes.
Well, how many of those identity providers already have that step up?
Well, what we're seeing is if you've looked in the past 2 years, quite a few of them have evolved. So that's the other thing I agree we need to look at. But the other question is, it's not your identity. You haven't done it. If it's hacked, you don't know. Is there anything you want to add to that if you're going to let them have access? So I see right now, based on the technology today, a clear boundary, which you can tell, between the low-risk use cases that this makes abundant sense and higher-risk use cases where I might hesitate. And I think it depends on the level of risk and how whether you want to own that versus allowing someone externally to do it. And then you start adding cloud to this, it becomes very interesting. What are you going to do with all your cloud identities? My company and other companies offer the capability to extend your provisioning solution between enterprise and cloud. I expect that to evolve to include social and have all of this start blending together, but you're absolutely right. I'm seeing these identity vendors investing a lot of money because they want that identity to be your identity that you might even take from one workplace to the other. I saw another hand over here. Yes?
Yeah, a couple of comments. In the healthcare world, there's a big push on to create provider directories. And so they'll have their separate identification process that will come through. Even that's a struggle. How do you really profile it? Some are talking about looking at activity based on claims submitted. Oh, this physician hasn't submitted claims for the last 3 months. Kind of iffy. So we're not seeing sort of tying activity to enrich that profile.
Absolutely. The behavioral profiling is key in this. And that's why, I'll come back in just a second, why I'm seeing also a big uptake. Show of hands how many people have heard about intelligent access, meaning the typical type of access control, but instead of stopping with, hey, this is the identity, I recognize the identity, so I will give them access to what this says they should have access to, but doing the extra step, and healthcare is where I'm hearing a lot of this, but I'll use a purchasing example instead, briefly, where I have a young lady who has logged into a customer portal within a company. She's looked at a lot of customer information because that she owns those accounts. She's the sales rep for them. She downloads a lot of that information, very sensitive information about what's the status, what they've purchased in the past, what the opportunities are. And then she logs off. About 15 minutes later, she logs back on. It's from a machine you don't recognize. That's context most access processes don't really take into account. And I take the extra step of running a quick query of what she's done recently. and I realize that she logged in last from New York. This is 15 minutes later from China. This is clearly not her. So taking those extra steps is something that I am seeing, and we are working on as well, to augment our access control solutions so they provide this intelligent access, this greater visibility. Is that part of what your question was?
Yeah. I follow up my comment with a question. So most of my clients are in the healthcare world, and their reach out to patient and citizens is through patient portals, which are tied to electronic medical records of physicians. But I'm seeing out there some of the vendors now sort of trying to be patient-centric, are saying, hey, let's use OpenID, which is Google, Yahoo, and others, but it allows the patient to log in to any physician who is using that vendor as a customer for PHR. So it might be Sutter has that vendor as their PHR, personal health record, and so has the other competition like Dignity Health has the same vendor. So the patient can log in under any different type of branding of any physician using that. But the issue around is how strong is that ID?
Absolutely.
And is the daisy chain again? And we'll never know if it gets weakened or what happens.
The only thing about that that is in its favor, well, there's two parts. One is obviously it would make the healthcare providers' lives much easier to not have to have the single identity. The patient's life is much easier because they get to use one instead of one for each different provider. But the other thing is that you're actually allowing the customer to choose to do this. So if I see healthcare organizations doing that, what I'm expecting is some patients to have to sign a waiver accepting and opting to do that. That way they're taking that responsibility onto themselves. I can't imagine, and maybe I'm wrong, but I can't imagine large sets of the healthcare providers signing up to this under the just stacks of regulations that are applying to you now.
That's the problem. No matter if I can't get a patient to waive their right for my obligation, for my client, to enforce who is going to disclose it to.
Exactly. That is exactly my point. Absolutely. There was another hand. Yes.
So backing up to when we were talking a little bit about possibly using this for your employees, how do you get around the problem of employees that have left the company? Now you've got an identity that you're not managing, but you've left the company. How do you turn off that access?
Most of the people that well,
Delete them out of the data.
it's basically, it's one thing to recognize an identity and have an authenticated identity come in. You don't have to authorize them to do anything.
Right, I know.
Well,
So if we're talking about employees,
yes.
that implies that we're going to give them a little bit more privileged access per se than in a non.
Well, let's use the case I was talking about. The female sales rep who was not clearly in China, but she decides to take another position. Just like I would have to deprovision anyway. So when you're using employees, you haven't removed all of the cost associated with this. A lot of this cost is still there. That was a key part of my point. But your deprovisioning is deauthorizing, right? So all you do is, I know one organization that handles this, they never actually delete an account ever. What they do is they use Active Directory as the back end, they drag the account and they drop it into a group that has rights to nothing. So, yeah, exactly. So that's how they handle that scenario.
The reason I asked the question is we didn't talk about it. But
Yeah.
It might have been.
Go.
I want to make sure that we weren't saying that the onus is still on the company to do
No.
some portion of that whole model. We
Yeah.
have to put these provisions.
The real question is, if you're letting them have access at all, you're responsible. So you may have taken some of the work out, all the liability is still yours. So I see this as an advantage of keeping some information in. There's another whole discussion, which would be a whole other presentation, but there's the other topic of, once you start blending social information into the workplace, what happens when the employer starts seeing social information that they're not supposed to look at to make hiring, firing, and promotion decisions? So you have a whole other that comes with this that's beyond the scope of this presentation. Yes. Yeah. So, any other questions on this? Finishing a bit early here. So, I know you're depressed by that.
Well, what you mentioned about the credit card behavior, actually credit card companies don't do that. Those street gasoline cards, you live in Southern California and then you see an abnormal charge along the 5, they're going to call you and say, This doesn't look right, because through the last 3 months, you were down here already starting this. Also, you see a couple massive charges up in the north. How did that occur? So that's something now.
Absolutely. The banks are doing a lot here. Credit card companies are doing quite a bit here. It's a little bit of overlap there. PCI was created to transfer risk, right? PCI was created by the credit card companies to force everybody in their supply chain to be more secure so that they would have a lower liability. So a lot of this is happening. You're seeing some of this fraud technology make it into enterprises. A portion of my company has a solution for this. And the challenge that comes with this is typically the same that's typical for all. How do you deal with false positives, and how do you learn what is appropriate or inappropriate activity? And it all comes down to the identity, which is why this topic is important.
And then the credit card scammers get they're using Bluetooth 4.0 because of range now. So you can skim out credit cards. So like if you look at some of your gas stations, they have actually a tape across the lock there, and then most of your ATM machines are now blinking a green colored light. So that's the original device, because typically we as consumers don't look at this stuff. We just look at a number, and we don't know if it's scammed or not.
Absolutely.
Their little tweaks, it's just, you gotta notice those.
Yeah, absolutely.
You talked quite earlier about step-up authentication. So that's by level of access. But I'm also noticing, unless it's not the case, but I'm noticing Google is almost seems to be forcing me to reset my password after a certain period of time. Like in the last, about 3 weeks ago, I had my password correct. It accepted it on the third time, but then sent me over to another page and give me a new password.
I've seen quite a few improvements from Google over the last, 6 months. Quite a few improvements to how they handle this. Honestly, I've been so frustrated recently. I've been forgetting a lot of my passwords so much. I'm now half convinced that I'm not forgetting, that they're just making me reset by pretending I forgot.
That's right.
Yeah, I don't really think so, but it makes me feel better. If that's it, I'd be happy to stay and discuss this further, but yes?
Not a question, but he's at the Verizon session where they were talking about some spear phishing campaigns. Interesting enough, they're sending very direct emails or notifications that there seems to be a strange charge on your account, please log in and verify. And there's a spear phishing attack. So now they're already responding to what we know to be a very good practice that the credit card companies are wisely checking, hey, did you really mean to do that? And that's already being utilized by the bad.
And those emails are highly produced, and if you click on one, which I don't recommend, you'll go to a website that really looks like it's that vendor. So these things are very well done and highly produced.
If you look at the cyber security landscape we talked about, this whole conference, the thing that we're not, from my perspective, is the next generation. We're teaching kids how to use computers and using learning management systems. They're not aware of the risks associated, because an Emoto to them is a learning management system, online classes. That if I take that page out, it looks exactly the same and say, hey, there's the next chapter you need to read. Click on the link. They're going to click on it. At that point, I can actually download a Trojan along the way, capture what I need to do, and then go spin off of that. So we need to educate not us, but the next generation as well coming up. That's what's going to happen.
Absolutely.
And when my friends come from Europe and they're doing their banking, every one of them, they all have a small new device with a number of changes, they can log into their banking. And we don't have anything like that yet here in the States.
No, and their credit card security systems are far superior to ours in the physical card. It's caused me no end of trouble when I'm traveling in Europe.
Right.
Okay, if there are no other questions, again, I'll be happy to stay and answer anything one-on-one, but I think I'll let you out a little earlier. I spoke a bit faster than I meant to. Thanks.